Welcome to the 4th devlog for Cloudscape. Also a warm welcome to the 700 new followers who have joined since the previous video. In this devlog, I'll be going over how I've set up the digging skill. I'll also cover how I've planned tree growth cycles and natural tree growth, which also ties into digging. Finally, I'll give an overview of where the farming system is currently at, along with the plans I have for it. Also, you might note that I've made the water a little bluer because I was getting a lot of feedback about the water being a little too purple looking, so now we got this nice blue-green sort of beach, which I like. First off, let's take a look at digging. I think in most games similar to this, digging is sort of a tacked-on system. Generally, you're given small indicators of where a handful of buried items are located. You dig at that spot and you get an item. That's pretty much the extent of these systems. In Animal Crossing, you can also bury items, which get marked with an X. I like the idea of being able to bury things, so I definitely want to implement that into the system. So what I ended up going with was allowing the player to dig and cover up holes on all ground surfaces, including grass, dirt, and sand. By digging around on the ground, the player will sometimes dig up some of the resources that each ground type is made of. For example, digging in grass areas might dig up the grass item, which is a resource used in crafting. Digging in dirt areas will also sometimes dig up the dirt item, and digging in sand areas will sometimes produce the sand item. All three of these items are used in various crafting, so the player can gather these resources by digging. On top of that, I also wanted to make sure to implement digging up of other random items. In particular, I have 5 current buried item types: player buried items, random buried items such as stones, coal, flint, worms, and so on, fossils, artifacts, and buried treasure. Player buried items are pretty self-explanatory. Random buried items are more common items such as resources, seeds, and random objects. Fossils are of course meant to be collected to complete sets of fossils. Artifacts can be collected to sell or donate to the museum. Buried treasure will contain a chest which has some rare items, resources, and money inside. There are a few ways I could go about doing random buried items. I could just have it so when the player digs in the ground, there's a chance for a random item to pop out. This means it doesn't matter where the player digs, just eventually an item will pop out. There's a lot of issues with this method, namely, since the player can bury their own items, it would have to do a separate check to make sure it doesn't pop up a random item when digging up a player item. The bigger issue is that because the buried items aren't actually set to a location, there's no real reason for the player to explore and dig in different areas. They can just dig in one small area and eventually find items. The second way is to store a buried item variable in each tile's information, which would allow for different items assigned to specific tiles around the island. The problem with this method is it would be loading and saving all of the extra tile information every time a level needs to save or load. The third solution that I decided to go with was to simply store buried items in a list which gets saved and loaded. With this list, I only need to load it in at the start, and only need to simply add or remove a list item when new buried items are added or removed. The way I'm storing items in the list is by storing them in a string, which I can split to get specific information. I store a buried item like this: the X position of the buried item, the Y position of the buried item, the name of the item buried, and finally the quantity of the item buried. By using string split with an @ symbol as the token, I can retrieve each bit of info separately. So the way the whole thing comes together is when the player digs into the ground, the code checks to see if that dig XY position is contained in our buried item list. If it's not, we simply dig a hole with nothing coming out of it. But if the XY position is somewhere in the list, we then get the item index where the XY position is located in the list. Now we have access to the buried item info. We can grab that info, have it pop out an item, and then remove that item from the buried item list. That's basically how buried items work. The remaining process is to just have a script that picks a ground space at random over time and adds a new buried item to it. This means I can always have a specific amount of buried items all over the island. I'm also controlling how frequently different types of buried items spawn, with random common items spawning often and rare treasures having a lower chance to spawn. Each island has its own buried item list stored, along with a different set of items that can be buried. This means each island will have its own types of buried items and will keep track of everything that is buried. There's another reason I wanted to implement the system this way. It means buried items sort of always exist in their location. This is good because of the next part of the digging system. See, there's nothing on the ground to indicate that something is buried there. No little X, no wiggly sticks, no discoloration of the ground. Ground with a buried item under it looks exactly the same as ground with nothing buried under it. So how is the player supposed to find buried items? Having them dig randomly would be frustrating and boring. Instead, I'm having the shovel double as a sort of buried item detector. Much like a metal detector works, the buried item detector will be able to detect nearby buried items. This gives a strong purpose for upgrading shovels. The better the shovel upgrade, the farther and more accurate the buried item detection gets. The most basic shovel will have very weak detection. It means it will only indicate a buried item nearby briefly, while a higher tier shovel will give a very strong detection and last longer, so it's much easier to find buried items. I haven't finalized how this detection will work, but my thoughts are to have a slight sort of ping sound the player will hear while the shovel is equipped, along with a smaller meter under the shovel icon which flashes on and off. The more filled the meter becomes, the closer the player is to a buried item. I'm hoping this will make treasure hunting more fun. The player can equip their trusty shovel and then wander around scanning the area for buried items. Then they start digging in a good area and eventually find the treasure. One final thing to note is that digging will require stamina, and will most likely require more stamina per dig than any other tools. This is because digging can be really powerful to find good items, so I don't want the player to just spam digging 1,000 holes to keep getting rare items. As I mentioned before, the player can also bury their own items. This could be for safe storage of an item, or maybe if I add multiplayer, then other players can hunt for items. While most items just get buried, there are some items that when buried will actually do something different. At the moment, this specifically applies to tree seeds. When the player buries a tree seed, it simply plants a new tree. This leads us into the next part of the devlog: trees. I touched briefly on trees in the previous video where I discussed procedural generation for the island. You should definitely watch that video if you haven't already. The link will be at the end of this video. In that video, I only talk about how trees are initially generated on the island. However, because the player will be on this one island for a while, trees are kind of a limited resource. It would be possible for a player to just chop down all the trees and no longer have access to more wood. This is bad. So of course I want to give full-grown trees the ability to produce new trees nearby. What I've set up at the moment is sort of a complex system, so I'll try to break it down. First, a tree has 6 stages of growth, from seedling to sapling to tiny to small to medium to full-grown tree. During the seedling stage, the player can simply dig up the seed to get the item. In this case, we can dig up and bury a pine cone. This is the start of a pine tree. After 5 days, the seedling grows into a sapling. At this stage, we can dig up the sapling to get a sapling item. We can bury the sapling to continue the tree growth process from there. From there, the tree will continue to grow to a new stage every 5 days. After 25 days, a tree completes its growth cycle. Once a tree is fully mature, it will wait a while until it reaches a point where it will drop a new seed. A new seed drops one of 2 ways. The first is by having the player hit or shake the tree. This will drop the new seed in the form of a pine cone. The player can then do whatever they want with the pine cone. They can sell it, craft with it, or bury it to make a new pine tree. The second way a tree drops a seed is via strong wind. Yeah, I've implemented wind into the game, as you may have noticed during this video. It will impact different objects in different ways. For trees, this means once an adult tree is ready to drop a seed, if it gets blown by the wind, it will simply drop its seed. But in this case, it doesn't drop a pine cone, it actually just plants the pine cone nearby. Each adult tree can plant 2 new trees this way. After they've done that, they will only store their seed until a player shakes or hits it. Then it will drop the seed item. I've limited trees to 2 natural plantings because after a year of not touching trees, any island you haven't visited will have thousands of trees, so I sort of needed to limit the growth rate. Otherwise, players would need to frequently travel to every single island and remove a bunch of trees to prevent having a jungle. Probably not very fun. Also, just a note, each stage of tree growth past the sapling stage can be cut down. As you might expect, it takes fewer hits to cut down smaller trees, and you'll get fewer resources from them. Waiting for the tree to fully mature will allow you to get the most resources from cutting it down, and it will also leave a stump, which you can gain further wood from. That sums up the digging skill and buried item system, along with natural tree growth and tree planting. I was going to go into the farming stuff in this video, but since these 2 topics ran long, I sort of ran out of time. Besides, I'd like to save farming for its own video since it's going to have a lot of stuff going on in it. I'll save that for the next video. I just want to note I haven't really made any music or sound effects for the game yet. I've sort of just been putting it off, but I'll have to dive into it soon. I plan to record the Foley for all of the sound effects on my own, which I've only had a little bit of experience doing, so maybe I can record doing some of that to show in a future video. Let me know what you think. Also, I just want to briefly mention, if you're excited about this game and want to talk more with me, it can be a lot easier for me to chat in the Cloudscape Discord over responding to YouTube comments. We have over 300 members on our Discord, and I'm active every day there. So if you want to chat with other fans of the game, post fan art, add your suggestions, ask me questions, or just hang out and chat, then consider joining the Discord. You can find a link to the Discord in the description below. With that said, I still try to respond to most every YouTube comment, so don't hesitate to comment here also. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and consider subscribing and sharing. As always, thanks for watching and see you in the next video.